Hello, my name is Aubree. After I became a widow, I thought the hardest part would be losing my father's presence. But the real pain came later, when my own family began cutting me out. They cropped me from photos, told me I had no vote, even shoved papers in front of me saying, "Just sign, we've already found a buyer." What they didn't know was that Dad had left me something none of them could touch, a flat in London. But why did I keep it a secret? And what did it cost me to stay silent? The January air in Boston was sharp enough to sting my skin as I stepped out of the church. The ground was stiff with frozen earth, and I thought to myself how fitting it was that my father would be lowered into something so cold. People huddled in their coats, the breath of mourners rising like smoke into the pale sky. I stood there with his watch clutched tight in my palm, my anchor, the one piece of him I refused to let go. Every tick had stopped years ago, but holding it against my skin gave me a strange illusion that he was still near. Relatives pressed around my siblings, patting their backs, telling them how strong they were. Neighbors passed casseroles wrapped in foil, promising to drop by again soon. No one turned to me. It wasn't just grief that weighed heavy on my chest. It was the hollow recognition that in this family hierarchy, I was a shadow. I nodded politely, thanked people who looked past me, and felt invisible in the house where I grew up. Inside the reception hall, laughter trickled from corners even as plates of food clattered onto the table. People said things like, "He lived a full life," and "Your father was such a good man." I smiled mechanically, even as the hollowness deepened. The truth was, the man who always shielded me from being dismissed was gone. Without him, I could already sense the shifting ground beneath my feet. The photographer called out for a family photo. My siblings lined up beside my mother, all putting on somber faces for the camera. I lingered near the edge, waiting for someone to beckon me closer. Nobody did. Still, I walked into frame, fixing my coat, hoping the picture would at least mark my presence. Later that evening, back at the house, I scrolled through social media. There it was, the family photo, already posted by my sister. My heart lurched when I saw it. I wasn't in it. The image had been cropped to show only them, the three of them surrounding my mother. My face, my body, erased. I stared until the screen blurred. At first, I told myself it might have been accidental, that maybe the crop was just to center the shot. But the laugh that escaped me was hollow, brittle. Deep down, I knew. It wasn't a mistake, it was symbolic. I had literally been cut out of the family picture. A line I once read surfaced in my mind. The cruelest form of abuse is to erase someone's existence. That evening, I felt those words carve themselves into my bones. I didn't shout or confront them. Instead, I tucked the humiliation away, like a shard of glass in my pocket. Dangerous, but mine to hold. I made a vow then, a silent promise only I could hear. Every slight, every moment of dismissal, I would remember. Not to wallow in it, but to remind myself of what they were capable of. The world might see them as loving children honoring their mother, but I knew better. And I knew one day that truth would matter. Days later, the house had settled into an unnatural quiet. The casseroles piled up in the fridge, untouched. I woke to the sound of my phone buzzing on the kitchen counter. Isolde's name flashed on the screen. "Hello?" I answered softly, hoping for warmth. Maybe just a moment of comfort from her. Her voice cut sharp through the line. "We need to talk about Dad's estate." "No, how are you? No, how have you been sleeping?" "Just business." I paused, fingers tightening around the mug I had poured but never sipped from. "Good morning to you too, Isolde." She exhaled sharply. "I don't have time for pleasantries. The house, the accounts, there are things that need sorting. We can't just sit in limbo." I listened, the sting of her impatience bleeding through every syllable. It wasn't just the words, it was the tone. As if I were a burden, as if my grief was an inconvenience she couldn't wait to push past. "I thought maybe you called to see how I was doing," I said, my voice even. Silence for a beat. Then she replied flatly, "We all have to move on, Aubree. It's not sustainable for you to sit in that big house alone." Her words lodged deep, sustainable, as though my life, my presence, was a cost-benefit analysis. I ended the call politely, but inside, a storm swirled. My father had been gone barely weeks, and already I was not a daughter to mourn, but a variable to manage. That night, I sat alone by the window, turning his watch over in my hand. I heard his voice in memory. Aubree, never let anyone make you feel like you don't belong. His faith had always been steady, even when no one else saw me. Now, his warmth echoed against the cold words of my family. I asked myself, why did they see me as fragile, disposable? Was I too quiet, too willing to let things slide? Maybe silence had always made me an easy target, but now, silence would be my shield. People love to say, blood is thicker than water. Yet sitting there, watching the moonlight spill across the floorboards, I realized sometimes family can drown you faster than any stranger ever could. A seed of strength stirred within me, not loud, not fiery, but steady. If they thought erasing me would be easy, they were mistaken. The house was still when I walked into the kitchen for water. But then I heard it, soft laughter, hushed whispers. My mother's voice, low and certain. My siblings leaning in. She doesn't need to know everything. My chest tightened. They were already planning, already building walls to keep me out. I stood in the hallway, unseen, and let the words settle. My grip tightened around the glass in my hand, but I didn't speak. I didn't need to. They think I'm in the dark, I whispered to myself, setting the glass down carefully. They have no idea what light I'm carrying with me. And that was the first time I realized my battle had only just begun. The house had quieted in the days after the funeral, but the silence wasn't the comforting kind. It was brittle, waiting to crack under the weight of what no one wanted to say out loud. The refrigerator was still crowded with casserole dishes from neighbors, lasagnas, baked ziti, chicken pot pies, food meant to feed grief, though no one touched them. My mother kept the kitchen spotless, counters gleaming as though order could erase absence. That evening, she called us to dinner. For the first time since the funeral, she set the dining room table like she used to, with placemats ironed flat and silverware lined in a straight row. The air was heavy with a forced normalcy, like the show of family mattered more than what anyone felt. My siblings chatted about errands and trivial details, weather forecasts, work emails, things that seemed trivial against the empty chair at the head of the table. My father's chair remained vacant, polished, as though still waiting for him to return. I sat down and stared at it for a long moment, the silence inside me louder than their shallow conversation. When I moved toward my usual place at the table, I stopped short. My chair was gone. In its place stood a smaller one, lower than the rest, the kind usually pulled from the kitchen when extra guests arrived. Its legs scraped against the floor as though reminding me where I stood in this house. I froze for a moment. "Why is my seat different?" I asked quietly, though my voice already knew the answer. My mother waved a hand dismissively. "It's just a chair, Aubree. Don't make a fuss." A soft chuckle came from across the table. My brother leaned back, smirking. "It suits you. The baby of the family should sit in the baby chair." The laughter that followed wasn't loud, but it cut all the same. I lowered myself onto the seat, the wooden edge digging uncomfortably into the back of my legs. From where I sat, my line of sight was lower than theirs. Symbolically smaller. It wasn't about wood or fabric, it was about being put in my place. I smiled faintly, not to agree, but to mask the sting. Inside, a quiet voice reminded me, "Respect isn't given, it's taken," I whispered to myself, almost under my breath. "I won't stay small forever." The meal moved forward as though nothing had happened, but I felt the humiliation press into my skin, sharp as glass. They filled the space with chatter that skimmed the surface. My sister recounted how her office was planning expansions. My brother bragged about a property deal he had nearly closed. My mother asked him questions, pride threading her tone. They spoke about college funds, mortgage rates, and future investments, their words overlapping like a closed circle of voices. Not once did anyone ask how I was doing. I sat quietly, fork tracing across my plate, observing the pattern like a detective piecing together evidence. Every word they spoke about Dad's estate was vague. "We'll figure it out. It's being handled. We'll talk about next steps soon. They spoke in half sentences, as though I wasn't there. They never looked at me when they mentioned decisions. I realized then that they weren't brainstorming. They were announcing. Plans had already been made, and this dinner was just another performance. I listened, storing every phrase. Hurt simmered, but awareness sharpened. They underestimated me. They thought silence meant weakness, but silence could be a sharper tool. People love to say, the squeaky wheel gets the grease. In this family, I knew better. Sometimes the silent one sharpens the blade. After dinner, I slipped upstairs. My siblings' laughter trailed behind me, the kind of easy amusement that comes when you believe you've won control. In my room, I pulled out my phone to distract myself. A notification blinked at the top of the screen. Our family group chat. I opened it absent-mindedly, expecting the usual reminders or grocery lists. But my eyes stopped cold at a single line from Isolde. Let's be honest, Aubree's too fragile to handle Dad's estate. A string of emojis followed. Thumbs up, a laughing face, a clapping hand. My brother had reacted, my mother too. I let out a laugh, though it echoed hollow in my chest. Fragile. Disposable. Too weak. I stared at the words, feeling their judgment coil tighter around me. I had hoped the dinner humiliation was a careless moment. But this was evidence. Their view of me wasn't accidental. It was intentional. Maya Angelou once said, "When people tell you who they are, believe them the first time." Staring at that message, I believed them. Every smile, every gentle dismissal at the table had only been the surface. Underneath, they had already written me off. But as I tucked the phone away, something else formed inside me, a decision. My father had trusted me with more than they knew. The London flat, the one thing no one else was aware of, was my card to play. Not yet, not now, but one day. For now, silence was my weapon. The air inside the house pressed heavy against me, so I stepped outside. The Boston night bit through my coat, sharp wind cutting across my face. I pulled the watch from my pocket, the one Dad had left me, and held it tight in my palm. The metal felt colder than the air, but it anchored me. I whispered into the night, if they think I'm weak, they're already playing the wrong game. Above me, the stars were faint behind city haze, but they were still there, scattered like promises. My breath clouded in the dark, and I felt a clarity settle inside me. That was the night I knew. I couldn't trust my own family anymore. The weeks that followed the funeral passed like slow-moving clouds, heavy and gray, but with every day the atmosphere in our house shifted. The mourning that had filled our living room gave way to papers spread across the coffee table, envelopes stacked in neat piles, and bills that no one had bothered to sort until now. The television stayed muted, the silence broken only by the shuffle of documents and the click of pens being tested for ink. I sat back, watching as my siblings leaned forward with sharp eyes, speaking in clipped tones. Their voices no longer carried grief. They carried calculation. My sister Isolde adjusted her glasses as if she were in a courtroom, tapping her pen against a legal pad. My brother crossed his arms, head cocked like someone ready to strike at an opening. Even their body language had changed. They weren't children grieving their father, they were business partners cutting deals. And my mother, Marla, sat at the head of it all, her posture straight, her tone cool. She wasn't the widow in black anymore. She looked like a CEO, presiding over her board. I could already feel it. The grief stage was over for them. What lay ahead wasn't about memory or loss. It was about power. "Aubree," my mother began, her voice smooth but sharp, "this house is too much for me. For you. People will talk if we don't act responsibly." She paused deliberately, looking at me the way a teacher looks at the slowest student. "We should sell it. It's not sustainable. And besides, it's not dignified for me to live here alone." I frowned. "People will talk?" She nodded. "Yes. Neighbors will say we're careless if we keep such a large home sitting half empty. It's about our family's honor." My chest tightened. "Family honor," I repeated, the words sour in my mouth. "Is this about money or about what the neighbors think?" She lifted her chin. "Both matter. Appearance matters. We don't want people to think we can't manage." I bit the inside of my cheek, the sting of it keeping me from snapping back. In this country, people care more about appearances than truths. It's the American way to keep up with the Joneses. I knew her angle. She wasn't asking. She was cornering me with the weight of reputation. My siblings nodded, their agreement almost rehearsed. To them, my silence meant consent. To me, it meant I saw the strategy. They weren't talking about responsibility. They were weaponizing gossip to pressure me into compliance. The discussion grew louder, each of them piling on practical reasons, as if layering bricks to build a wall around me. "The property taxes are steep," Isolde said matter-of-factly. "No way you can shoulder that alone." "The upkeep is too much," my brother added. "Look at the roof, the lawn. It's not realistic." "And you," Marla leaned closer, voice low and certain, "are too fragile to keep this house running." "You know it, and so do we." Their words circled me like vultures, each one tugging at a part of me, trying to reduce me to something smaller, weaker, fragile, unsustainable. Too much. I glanced down at the bills they had slid toward me, the papers they wanted me to sign. The shuffle of documents sounded louder than my pulse. Pens clicked impatiently, the sound like ticking clocks counting down to my inevitable surrender. But I stayed calm. Inside, the humiliation simmered like water just under a boil. Outwardly, I remained still, my silence deliberate. Silence is not weakness. Sometimes silence is strategy. They thought I was cornered. In truth, I was observing, memorizing every word, every tactic. Then it came, quick, sharp, like a slap I didn't see coming. My mother's face hardened, her tone breaking the false politeness. "At least your brother became something," she said, her words cutting the air. "What are you, Aubree?" The room froze. My siblings exchanged glances, then a couple of awkward chuckles leaked out, like they couldn't resist enjoying the spectacle. I felt the sting deep, sharper than anything they'd said before. The pain was hot, but I forced my face to stay composed, my breathing steady. I had been compared all my life, Isolde the accomplished one, my brother the promising one, and me, always the fragile one, the overlooked one. My mind flicked back to childhood dinners when achievements were tallied at the table like trophies, and I had none to show. Back then, Dad would pat my hand under the table, whispering encouragement. But now, without him, there was no shield. The wound was open, raw, and public. "The worst wounds are cut by the ones who raised you." The words echoed in my head, louder than the ticking clock on the wall, louder than the forced laughter still hanging in the room. I sat still, letting their cruelty hang in the silence. If they saw me as nothing, one day I would let them taste the weight of how wrong they were. When the meeting ended, they filed out, their papers tucked away, their plans continuing without me. I stayed in the quiet house, the air heavy with what had just unfolded. I picked up the scattered bills, stacking them slowly, methodically, as though touching them could give me back some control. Among them, I slipped my father's old folder under my arm, holding it close, unseen by them. "They're planning without me," I whispered to myself, erasing me in front of my own eyes. I walked into the stillness of the living room, the folder pressed tight to my chest, and that was when I realized their plans were already being written in ink, and mine had to stay in pencil, hidden for now. Sunday afternoons in our house used to mean Dad watching football in the living room while Mom simmered soup in the kitchen, the kind of comfort routine that wrapped the house in warmth. 3 weeks after his funeral, those Sundays had turned into board meetings. When I walked into the dining room, I saw the change immediately. The table wasn't set for dinner, but for business. Papers stacked in neat piles, laptops opened, pens lined up. My siblings leaned forward like executives in a planning session, their heads bent over documents I hadn't been invited to see. I stood there a moment, waiting for acknowledgement. None came. My mother's face was stern, her lips pressed thin. She didn't look up. Every chair was filled, except for the one where I used to sit. It was gone. My heart gave a heavy thud. This wasn't about grief or memory anymore. This was about dividing power, and I was walking in too late. I stepped closer, trying to pull out an extra chair. Before I could sit, Isolde raised her hand like a judge calling order. "This is just between us siblings, Aubree." I froze. "What do you mean? I am one of the siblings." Her eyes didn't waver. "Not in this," my mother added softly, almost sweetly. "You don't need to stress yourself with details, honey. Let us handle this." The words landed heavier than if she had shouted, "Honey," as if I were a child being protected from math I couldn't do. The sting of being infantilized burned hotter than anger. I stepped back, my fingers curling against the chair. My brother glanced up at me, his smirk small but cutting. No one moved to make space, so I stayed in the hallway, half in shadow, watching. Their voices sharpened, transactional. I caught fragments. "We can't wait for her. Decisions must be made. It's the practical path." Standing there, I felt the humiliation like a spotlight on me, erased from decision-making in my own home. My father's house. In America, families talk about inheritance like it's a business merger. Except I had been left out of the boardroom. I retreated into the living room, lowering myself into a chair that suddenly felt foreign. The house hummed faintly with their muffled voices, laughter rising occasionally like victory cheers. My name was mentioned once, faint, almost as if I were a line item on a budget. I sat there in silence, letting the words bleed through the walls, my ears catching the rhythm of their planning. They were finalizing without me, building scaffolding for a future where I didn't exist. Hurt came first, heavy and raw, but clarity followed, sharp and steady. This wasn't carelessness, this was strategy. They wanted me erased so smoothly that by the time I realized it, there'd be no space left to fight. I picked up a pen from the side table, opened a small notebook I'd left near Dad's old files, and began writing. Dates, overheard comments, exact phrases. If they thought my silence meant surrender, they were wrong. Silence is not surrender. Silence is when you sharpen your knives. That night, long after the so-called meeting ended and the house had gone quiet, I climbed into bed and scrolled through my phone. A new notification from Facebook caught my eye. My sister had posted a photo captioned, "Family meeting, moving forward together." I opened it. There they were. My mother, my siblings, sitting around the dining table in neat formation, papers visible, smiles faint but proud. And me? Cropped out. The photo was taken from an angle where I had stood in the doorway, yet the frame cut me clean away. My presence erased not just in life, but in the history they were writing for public view. I laughed once, a brittle sound that broke into silence. The sting of erasure was sharp, but it didn't surprise me anymore. This wasn't a mistake. This was narrative control. They weren't just excluding me from decisions, they were rewriting family history so that I had never been there to begin with. I whispered aloud, "The worst kind of loneliness is being forgotten by those who are supposed to remember you." I took a screenshot, quietly saving it. Not because I needed proof for myself, but because one day, evidence would matter. Standing by the window, the phone still warm in my hand, I listened to faint echoes of laughter from the kitchen where they were finishing leftovers. Their voices rose and fell like a language I no longer belonged to. "They're building a narrative without me," I murmured. "But they've forgotten. Narratives can be rewritten." I pressed Dad's folder tighter against my chest, the papers inside rustling softly like secrets waiting to be revealed. That was the night I swore, if they erase me, I'll carve my name back where they least expect it. The first warm winds of March moved through Boston that week, but inside our house, the air was heavier than ever. My mother decided to host what she called a simple coffee afternoon, inviting neighbors and a few distant relatives. She set out pie on glass plates and lined mugs across the counter, but I knew this wasn't hospitality. It was theater. The kitchen buzzed with polite laughter, the clink of silver spoons stirring sugar into coffee, and the hushed tone of people careful not to speak too loud. I stood by the doorway, watching as my siblings drifted through the crowd like seasoned performers. They charmed guests with easy smiles, touching shoulders, asking questions about families and children. To anyone looking from the outside, it was a picture of unity. 3 children caring for their widowed mother. To me, it was a stage carefully arranged to leave me standing in the wings. There's a saying I once heard, Sometimes family doesn't stab you in the back. They stab you in the living room with witnesses. That afternoon, I understood exactly what it meant. My gut told me something unpleasant was about to unfold, but I steadied myself, determined not to show how tightly my hands pressed into my palms. It happened when the coffee cups were nearly empty. My mother, her voice carrying just enough to silence the side conversations, spoke with a measured sigh. "We've asked Aubree to help with the house," she said, resting a hand dramatically on her chest. "But she resists." The words dropped like stones. Every head turned toward me. Before I could gather a response, Isolde chimed in sweetly, too sweetly. "If she truly loved Mom, she would agree to sign the papers. That's what love looks like, doesn't it?" A ripple moved through the room, guests shifting, uncomfortable. Some nodded faintly, others avoided my eyes. I felt my face grow warm, but my voice stayed calm. "Love isn't proven by signing papers," I said. My tone was even, my eyes steady. The silence that followed was worse than laughter. It was the kind of silence that confirmed alignment, a quiet agreement that the room now saw me as ungrateful. I sat down slowly, the humiliation heavy in my chest. Rage flickered under the surface, but I knew better than to let it rise here. Anger would only cement their narrative. In America, guilt is often the cheapest weapon and the most expensive to heal from. That thought held me in place, my fists clenched in my lap where no one could see. When the guests began leaving, I stepped outside for a breath of air, the cool breeze a sharp relief against my burning face. On the porch, I caught the low murmur of two neighbors speaking as they adjusted their coats. "Poor Marla," one whispered, not realizing I was just behind the door. "Her daughter Aubree's freeloading, not helping at all." The words cut deeper than I expected. My siblings' earlier performance had done its work. The rumor had already been planted. I opened the door fully, stepping past them with a polite smile, my throat tight enough to choke me. They smiled back awkwardly, their eyes shifting away, as if they hadn't just passed judgment on my life. Inside, my heart thundered. Reputation in a small American town is like wildfire. Once it spreads, you can't control where it burns. And now the flames had caught, smoke already billowing through conversations I couldn't hear. But instead of letting fury consume me, I held on to silence. Fury was quick, but silence could be sharp if wielded right. Later that evening, when the guests were gone and the dishes stacked in the sink, I sat alone at the table. The humiliation replayed in my mind, my mother's sigh, my sister's false sweetness, the nodding heads of neighbors who thought they were witnessing truth. I pulled out a notebook, writing down what I remembered. Exact words, who was present, who reacted, who nodded. Each remark, each witness, a record. I wasn't keeping score to wallow, I was building a case. They wanted to paint me as lazy, unfilial, fragile. I knew the strategy now. It wasn't about pushing me out of decisions. It was about destroying my image so no one would listen if I ever spoke. The hurt was real, heavy enough to crush if I let it. But with the hurt came resolve. I repeated a mantra to myself. I won't fight them with noise. I'll fight them with facts. I thought of my father's folder upstairs, the hidden documents, the London flat no one knew about. They had no idea I held something solid, something undeniable. This wasn't the last time they'd use public shame as a weapon, but it would be the last time I let it sting without preparing my own defense. On my way upstairs, I passed the hallway where my siblings had gathered behind a closed door. Their voices spilled out in laughter, muffled but clear enough for me to catch my name between their words. I stood there a moment, listening. My name was followed by mocking tones, laughter again, the kind that belonged to people confident they had control of the story. They were already erasing me with words, I whispered to myself, walking past their door. But words can be turned into evidence, too. That night, as I placed my father's folder on my desk and slid my notes inside, I made a silent vow. Let them write their script. Let them rehearse their performance. The final draft would be mine. By late March, the rain came down so hard against the windows that it sounded like fists on the glass. Inside, the dining table had been turned into a battlefield again. Bills and bank statements lay spread across the polished wood, folders stacked in ominous piles, pens set out as though they were weapons. My siblings sat shoulder to shoulder, their posture unified, their eyes cutting sharp toward me as though I were the defendant and they were the jury. My mother presided at the head like a judge ready to hand down a sentence. I lowered myself into a chair, noting the storm outside and how perfectly it mirrored the storm within these walls. The air was damp, oppressive, and heavy with expectation. I had no illusions about what was coming. They hadn't invited me here for conversation. This was about cornering me until I had nowhere left to turn. I thought of something my father used to say. When people form alliances, you can feel the verdict before the trial even begins. Sitting there, watching their faces, I already knew mine had been written. My mother was the first to move. With a swift motion, she pulled a thick envelope from her stack and slammed it flat on the table so hard the silverware rattled. A hospital bill slid out across the wood, numbers printed in bold at the bottom like a final judgment. "Can you even afford this, Aubree?" she asked, her tone deceptively calm. Then her eyes narrowed. "Or do you expect us to carry you?" The words hit me harder than the rain hammering outside. For a second, I stared at the bill, the weight of the accusation disguised as care. My siblings leaned forward, their faces masks of disappointment, yet I saw the flicker of satisfaction there. I drew in a breath, steadying myself. "I've managed myself before," I said evenly, lifting my eyes to hers. "And I will again." A laugh, low, derisive, came from my brother. "Sure you will." Isolde smirked, tapping her pen against the table. "Let's not pretend, Aubree. You don't have the resources. You've always leaned on others." My heart burned, but I refused to show tears. I leaned back slightly, my voice calm, though each word sliced inside me. "I know what I'm capable of. You don't have to remind me." Their laughter was quiet, but it circled me like wolves closing in. I reminded myself of a bitter truth. In America, health bills break more families than death itself. My father had once warned me about that. Now, here it was, being used not as a tragedy, but as ammunition against me. The storm outside cracked with thunder as the next blow came. Dorian reached under the table and pulled out a small, leather-bound book. My heart stopped. I recognized it instantly. My old diary, tucked away in a drawer I thought safe. He flipped it open casually, his voice dripping with mockery. "Look what I found. Always feeling left out, always whining." He cleared his throat and began reading. March 12th. "Sometimes I wonder if anyone in this family sees me at all." Laughter broke out across the table. My mother shook her head slowly, as if I were a disappointment laid bare. Isolde smirked, enjoying the performance. I froze, my chest tight. Then fury, quiet, controlled, rose in me like a tide. This wasn't just invasion. This was weaponized humiliation. I clenched my fists under the table, nails pressing into my palms. My voice stayed silent, but my thoughts burned. They used my own words against me, but words can cut both ways. The rain outside pounded harder, the storm echoing the humiliation building inside me. Dorian flipped through more pages, quoting lines about my loneliness, my doubts, my yearning to be seen. Each word twisted into entertainment for them, a spectacle of my pain. But I didn't give them what they wanted. I didn't cry. I didn't shout. I let the silence stretch, my face steady, though my insides burned raw. If they wanted me broken, they'd have to imagine it. Eventually, satisfied with their cruel display, they began to disperse. My mother stacked the bills again, sliding them back into their folder. My siblings exchanged smirks, as though they'd won some decisive battle. Chairs scraped, footsteps faded, and I was left alone at the table. The diary lay in front of me. Slowly, I picked it up, the worn cover soft under my fingertips. I pressed it against my chest, not as a symbol of weakness anymore, but as proof of how ruthless they were willing to be. The rain had seeped through the ceiling window, dripping steadily onto the hardwood floor. I sat there, listening to each drop as though it were counting down time, reminding me that I couldn't stay passive forever. Deep hurt welled up, sharp and heavy, but clarity rose with it. They had stripped my dignity in front of one another without flinching. If they could do this, they would do anything. Sometimes you don't need to fight fire with fire, I whispered to myself. You let it burn itself out. I slid the diary into my father's old box of files, alongside documents they hadn't yet discovered. My humiliation wasn't an end, it was a shift. Their cruelty was fuel, and one day, it would backfire. My silence wasn't surrender. It was a pause before the strike. I carried the box upstairs to my room, tucking it carefully into the closet. The storm outside had begun to ease, the pounding rain softening, a thin sliver of moonlight breaking through the clouds. I whispered, steady and certain, if they see me as powerless, they're already losing. The moonlight stretched across my desk, spilling over the leather of the diary, now hidden within my father's papers. Humiliation had been replaced with resolve. That night, I stopped asking for a seat at their table. I started building my own. It was early April when the air in the house grew sharper than the spring wind outside. The library had always been a sanctuary for me and my father, a place where the smell of leather-bound books and dust mixed with his quiet laughter. Now it was just another stage for my siblings to perform. Guests had been invited, neighbors, an old friend of my mother's, and a distant cousin who liked to insert herself into family matters. I stood in the doorway as Isolde gestured toward the shelves with a gracious smile, her voice dripping with pride. "Dad's collection really is extraordinary," she said. "I curated most of these volumes myself, took years to track them down." My stomach tightened. Those books weren't hers. They were ours, my father's and mine. I remembered afternoons at the flea market, evenings poring over catalogs, the excitement on his face when we found a rare edition. Those shelves held pieces of my childhood and of him. To hear her claim it so effortlessly was like being erased again. I stepped forward, my voice steady but soft. "That's not quite true, Isolde. Dad and I collected those together." She turned toward me with a smile that didn't touch her eyes. "You always exaggerate, Aubree. Everyone knows you never had the patience for this kind of work." The guests chuckled politely, and the conversation moved on without me. My face flushed, but I forced myself into silence. Credit is cheap until it's stolen from you, I thought bitterly. Defending myself out loud only gave her more ground to twist my words. I stood there, heart pounding, deciding it was better to let them expose themselves than to argue in front of an audience that had already chosen their hero. A few days later, I got a call from Isolde. Her voice was warm, syrupy. "We should talk, just us sisters. Let's get coffee downtown." Part of me wanted to believe she meant it. That maybe, just maybe, there was still a chance she wanted to bridge the gulf between us. So I agreed. The cafe was bright and filled with the hum of city life. She greeted me with a hug that felt staged, her perfume sharp in my nose. At first, her tone was gentle, weaving in memories of our childhood, but soon her questions sharpened. "How much are you making these days?" she asked, her spoon stirring a latte she hadn't tasted. "Do you have savings? Enough to cover your expenses?" I blinked. "Why do you need to know that?" She leaned closer, lowering her voice as if to show concern. "I just don't want you to end up struggling. Living here alone, you know?" The mask slipped with every word. This wasn't a sister checking in. This was an audit disguised as intimacy. I smiled faintly, choosing my replies carefully. "I manage just fine. I always have." Her eyes searched mine, probing for weakness. I gave her none. Inside, betrayal settled in my chest like a stone. Sometimes the sharpest knives are wrapped in smiles, I reminded myself. We left the cafe together, but I walked away with a different kind of strength. I knew now to hold my inheritance close. The London flat was my shield, my secret, and they would never get near it. A week later, my mother called me into the kitchen. She held a credit card in her hand, her smile soft, but her eyes hard. "We thought this would make your life easier," she said, pressing it toward me. At first, I almost let myself feel grateful. Support, at last. Then I noticed the embossed names. It wasn't just mine. It was tied to a family account. I realized immediately that every limit, every transaction would be monitored. "It's just to keep you safe, Aubree," Isolde chimed in, her voice as sweet as poisoned honey. So you don't overspend or forget a bill. We'll make sure you're taken care of. I slid the card into my pocket, hiding the fury that rose inside me. To them, this wasn't help. It was a leash, a chain disguised as generosity. In America, debt is often a chain, I thought grimly. But this wasn't debt. It was ownership. I smiled politely. Thank you. That's very thoughtful. They seemed pleased, exchanging looks of satisfaction. Let them think they had bound me tighter. I already knew what to do. I would keep the card, but never use it. If they wanted to believe I was tethered, I would let them. Meanwhile, my freedom was safe in the documents they hadn't discovered. Later that week, I walked through the city streets, the early evening air cool against my skin. The weight of humiliation piled high, the stolen credit for the books, the cafe interrogation, the false generosity of a monitored card. But beneath it all, something sharper had taken root. My father's words came back to me, whispered from years ago. Patience, Aubree. Silence is strength when noise would only betray you. I whispered into the wind. They can bind me in their games, but only if I play by their rules. I knew now that silence was no longer just a shield. Soon, it would be a sword. That night, back in my room, I opened the drawer beside my bed. I laid the family credit card inside, right next to my father's watch and the folder of hidden papers. False chains beside true freedom. I looked down at them, my breath steady. They thought they handed me a leash, I murmured. What they didn't know, I was already holding the key. And the next move they made would prove just how desperate they were to break me. By mid-April, the invitations had shifted from phone calls to summons. My siblings insisted I attend a final discussion, the kind of phrase that pretends to be neutral but drips with warning. When I walked into the dining room that evening, I felt like I had stepped into a boardroom, not my father's house. The table gleamed under the chandelier, cleared of food but crowded with folders and thick envelopes. Pens sat in a perfect row beside each stack, as though signatures were more important than people. My siblings were already in their places. Isolde, composed and sharp. Dorian, tapping his foot like a man too eager for the verdict. And my mother, centered at the head of the table with her back straight, eyes cold. Only one chair remained, pushed into the corner of the room, slightly apart from the rest. That was meant for me. Symbolically sidelined, literally cast out. I lowered myself into it, forcing my breathing to stay steady. It felt less like family, more like a courtroom where I was the accused. And in that instant, I knew they weren't here to talk. They were here to seal my exclusion. Isolde was the first to speak, her tone cutting through the heavy silence. We all agreed. Aubree doesn't get a vote. Her words struck like a gavel. My mother nodded slowly, as though this were mercy. It's for your own good. You can't handle this. We'll take care of it. Heat rose in my chest, but I kept my voice even. This is my father's legacy, too. You don't get to erase me from it. Isolde's lips curled into a cold smile. Dad trusted me with these matters. You'll thank me later. The audacity nearly knocked the breath from me. Thank her for stripping me of my right to decide. The humiliation burned hotter than anything they had thrown at me before, because it wasn't whispered in corners or masked in jokes. It was open, declared, written in black and white terms. I didn't matter. I clenched my hands beneath the table, willing my face to remain calm. Inside, a storm roared, but even as humiliation cut deep, determination sparked. The moment they say you don't matter is the moment you start proving you do. Dorian pushed a paper across the table, sliding it until it stopped in front of me. Just sign this. It's for Mom's medical care. The page looked harmless, a standard form, clean and official. But something in me bristled. I leaned closer, tracing the small print with my eyes. And there it was, buried deep. Clauses about property transfer, authority ceded, signatures granting them power over decisions that were not theirs to take. My throat tightened. This isn't about health care, I said flatly. Dorian shrugged, playing innocent. Don't be dramatic. It's just a formality. I pushed the paper back toward him, my voice quiet but sharp. If it's so harmless, you can sign it yourselves. The air thickened. My mother's lips thinned into a hard line. Isolde's composure cracked for a split second, her eyes flashing frustration before she masked it again. That slip told me everything. The paper wasn't just a document, it was proof. Proof they wanted me erased, not just in family talk, but legally, permanently. Betrayal carved deep, deeper than before, but clarity came with it. Trust once broken doesn't just vanish, it turns into armor. When the meeting ended, silence clung to the room like smoke after a fire. No laughter, no pretense of unity, just the sound of chairs scraping back, papers shuffled into folders, and my siblings leaving with their victory unfinished. I walked out with my head high, though my heart hammered against my ribs. My mask of calm stayed fixed, but inside I burned with hurt and relief all at once. Relief that I hadn't signed, that my instincts had saved me from their trap. In the quiet of my room later, I whispered to myself, for once, my silence wasn't compliance, it was protection. Sometimes saying nothing is the loudest thing you can say. They thought they had cornered me, but all they did was reveal the depth of their desperation. And if they were this desperate now, I knew the next strike would come harder. But now I saw their game fully, and I was no longer walking blind. I carried a copy of that false document to the fireplace, my fingers tightening around it as flames cracked against the logs. The paper curled and blackened, words turning into smoke that rose into the chimney. The fire glowed in my eyes as I whispered, "They want me erased on paper, but I'll carve my truth in stone." The flames hissed, the air thick with smoke and finality. I stood there until the last piece of paper was nothing but ash, my resolve steadier than ever. And in that moment, I knew the real war had only just begun. By late April, the air in our house was heavy with spring pollen and something sourer, harder to name. My siblings insisted on a family dinner, but the moment I saw the guest list, I understood. It wasn't a family dinner at all, it was a stage. Neighbors filled the chairs, and at the far end of the table sat Leora, my childhood friend, who had always been a quiet witness to the undercurrents of my family. The table sparkled with expensive china that rarely saw daylight, roast chicken steaming at the center, vegetables arranged with precision. Forced smiles lined the room, polite small talk carried on like a current trying to disguise the rocks beneath. I sat quietly, fork poised, sensing every detail. The gleam of wine glasses, the neatly folded napkins, the overbright laugh of my sister trying too hard. Some families solve fights behind closed doors. Mine prefers an audience. Halfway through the meal, my mother leaned forward, her voice carrying over the chatter. "You know, we should all be proud of Claire," she said, gesturing to the neighbor's daughter sitting across from me. "So independent, successful, thriving in her career. If only Aubree were like that." The room chuckled softly, the neighbor shifting awkwardly, cheeks flushing. My siblings smirked, eyes flicking to me. I forced a smile, though inside I felt the knife slide between my ribs. To be measured against outsiders at my own table, erased as a daughter in front of strangers, it was deliberate, not careless. Comparison is a thief, I thought bitterly. But in families, it's also a weapon. I chewed quietly, my silence thick. Survival sometimes meant not giving them the show they wanted. Shame and bitterness pooled in me, but I kept my mask intact. If they wanted me humiliated, they would have to imagine it. The laughter faded, conversation dipped, and then my mother's mask slipped completely. Her voice snapped through the room, sharp as glass breaking. "You were a mistake from the start." The words crashed into me, louder than the clink of forks freezing mid-air. The air in the room seemed to vanish, leaving me gasping silently. The neighbors fell into stunned silence, utensils paused halfway to their mouths. My siblings avoided my gaze, though a couple smirked faintly, the complicity shining in their eyes. My body went still. I felt the blood drain from my face, my hands pressing into my lap until my nails dug into skin. The worst rejection isn't from strangers, it's when the person who gave you life denies you. The words echoed in my chest, heavier than stone. That one sentence severed the last fragile illusion I'd clung to. That maybe, somewhere, there was still a thread of belonging for me in this family. It was gone. Raw pain coursed through me. but beneath it, something icy and sharp took root. Clarity. Then Isolde seized the silence, her voice dripping with cruelty. She gestured toward Leora, who sat frozen beside the neighbors. See? Even her own friend knows she's fragile. Look at her face. Leora's eyes widened, her hands gripping her napkin. She didn't speak, but her gaze met mine, and it wasn't pity, it was sympathy. Real, quiet care, standing in stark contrast to the malice surrounding me. My humiliation deepened, the heat of shame crawling up my throat. But in that moment, I realized something profound. Humiliation only works if I accept it. I inhaled slowly, my face calm, though my chest ached. Strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it's the quiet breath that says, "Tomorrow I'll rise." The room continued without me, voices stumbling awkwardly back to small talk, the roast chicken cooling on plates no one touched. But I was elsewhere, already building something in silence, already carving resolve from pain. By the time dessert was served, the dinner had collapsed into a strained quiet, broken only by my siblings' forced laughter. I pushed my untouched plate back and rose from the table. "I'm done," I said softly, but the words carried. I walked out of the room, the weight of every eye following me, and Leora quietly slipped her chair back to follow. Outside, the air was cool, the evening sky streaked with fading light. I stopped on the porch, my chest still heavy, my pulse still pounding. "They thought tonight broke me," I whispered, gripping my father's watch in my hand. But tonight only burned away what was left of my illusions. And from the ashes of that dinner, my resolve was born. By early May, the air had shifted. The daffodils outside were bright, but inside the house, everything was cold, as though the walls themselves waited for the inevitable. My siblings sent word that this was the final settlement meeting, a phrase that carried the weight of inevitability. When I walked into the dining room, I saw the trap laid out as neatly as a banquet. The table wasn't for meals, it was for signatures. Piles of documents sat in stacks, real estate brochures fanned out, pens lined up like soldiers ready for duty. My siblings exchanged knowing smiles, their confidence thick in the air. My mother sat tall at the head, face unreadable, but hands folded like a judge preparing to hand down a sentence. I took my seat, the pressure heavy, but beneath it was a calm only I knew. They thought this was the end for me. They thought I'd been cornered. What they didn't know, I was already holding the escape key. The knock on the door broke the rhythm of their plans. My mother frowned, annoyed at the interruption, but Dorian rose to open it. Standing there was my father's longtime friend, Richard Hale. His gray hair was damp from the drizzle outside, his coat still buttoned. He stepped inside as though the house was still his friend's, not a battlefield. "Aubree," he said warmly, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Your father spoke of you with such pride." He ignored the others, not even a nod in their direction. From his coat pocket, he pulled out an envelope. He placed it directly into my hands, his voice steady. "Your father trusted you more than anyone. He asked me to make sure this reached you when the time was right." My siblings stiffened, their smiles faltering. My mother's frown deepened. I slid the letter open carefully, my heart racing, though my face stayed composed. Inside was my father's handwriting, steady even in his last months. He confirmed everything. The London flat was mine, purchased in my name, untouched by anyone else's hands. Silence clung to the room, my siblings exchanging nervous glances. My mother shifted in her chair, her disbelief obvious. Truth doesn't always arrive on time, but it arrives. Relief surged through me, not loud, but steady, like a foundation I could finally stand on. I stood, my chair scraping lightly against the floor. I placed the documents on the table, letting them rest between the piles they had arranged. "You've been fighting over scraps," I said calmly. "But Dad left me the London flat, entirely mine." The silence that followed was thick enough to choke. My siblings froze, eyes wide, mouths half open. My mother's face drained of color, her hands clutching the edge of the table. Years of humiliation overturned in seconds. All the whispers, the exclusions, the staged performances, crushed under the weight of one truth they couldn't twist. Isolde was the first to recover, her voice sharp. "This must be fake." Before I could answer, Richard's voice cut through, calm and firm. "No, I witnessed the papers myself. I helped your father finalize them. He wanted this for Aubree, and only Aubree." The room deflated like a punctured balloon. My siblings' protests faltered, dissolving into silence. The best revenge is not rage. It's the truth they can't twist. I let the moment hang, their disbelief louder than any scream. My victory wasn't in shouting. It was in standing there, steady, while their illusions collapsed. The room splintered after that. Dorian argued with Isolde in hushed but heated tones. My mother scolded them, trying to reassert control, but the cracks had already spread. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. Truth was enough. Quietly, I gathered the documents and tucked them into my father's old leather folder. The feel of it grounded me, reminding me that I no longer needed their recognition. And I had my father's, and that was enough. You can't choose your family, I thought, but you can choose your peace. As they bickered, I rose, the folder firm in my hands. I looked at them one last time, not with anger, but with clarity. This victory was only the beginning. My independence was no longer a secret. It was fact. I gathered my coat, slipped the folder under my arm, and walked toward the door. The room fell quiet, my siblings staring, powerless for the first time. I turned back briefly, my voice steady. This chapter of your control is over. The next chapter, mine, is waiting in London. I stepped outside, the spring air fresh and bright, sunlight breaking through the clouds as though the sky itself was lifting its veil. And that day, I finally understood. Silence had always been my sharpest weapon. The morning after the confrontation was unlike any other. The house that had always rung with chatter, arguments, and footsteps was still, unnervingly so. I woke to silence, broken only by the creak of floorboards when someone moved upstairs. My siblings kept to their rooms. The usual whispers plotting their next moves had vanished. My mother sulked behind her closed door, refusing to look at me even when we crossed paths in the hallway. It wasn't triumph I felt, not the kind that comes with fireworks or fanfare. It was relief, heavy and bittersweet, like finally setting down a weight that had carved into your shoulders for years. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the familiar cracks in the wood, listening to the hum of the refrigerator. The absence of their voices wasn't lonely, it was confirmation. They had lost their grip, and though they didn't admit defeat, the quiet was proof enough. Victory doesn't always feel like fireworks. Sometimes it's just the absence of noise. I knew then that staying wasn't an option. Leaving was no longer about survival. It was about freedom. I walked through the house slowly, each step echoing more with memory than sound. The dining room came first, the same table where they had silenced me, where papers had been slid across as if my life were theirs to sign away. My hand brushed the edge of a chair, and I pulled it back as if burned. That room was no longer wood and plaster. It was a monument to my erasure. The library came next. I ran my fingers over the spines of books Dad and I had collected together, the same books Isolde once claimed as her achievement. My throat tightened, not with anger this time, but with sorrow. Those shelves, that room, it should have been a legacy of love, not theft. I went upstairs, pausing outside my father's study. I stepped inside, inhaling the faint scent of old paper and tobacco that lingered still. His desk was clear now, but I remembered him bent over it, scribbling notes, calling me to check a passage, his eyes crinkling with pride. The space carried both warmth and loss, and I felt the ache of knowing it had been twisted into a stage for betrayal. I didn't take much as I moved from room to room. Only what mattered: his watch, the leather folder with the London documents, and the letter he left for me. Sometimes you have to leave most of the house behind to carry the home with you. I whispered another truth to myself. You can't carry baggage if you want to fly. I stopped outside my mother's room, the door closed, shadows leaking from the small gap beneath. For a moment, I thought about knocking. A part of me longed for her to open it, to look at me just once with something other than disappointment. I wanted one word, one acknowledgement, something I could carry that wasn't poison. But I knew better. She wouldn't open the door. She wouldn't offer what she had never given freely: respect. I exhaled slowly, turning away. Closure is a gift people rarely give, I murmured to myself. Sometimes you have to write it for yourself. So I gave it to myself, by walking away. I closed each door gently behind me, sealing not just the room but the years of illusions that had kept me bound. The house wasn't home anymore. Love without respect was nothing but a prison, and I wasn't meant to serve a sentence for a crime I didn't commit. In my room, I packed my suitcase with precision. No sentimental clutter, no unnecessary weight. A few changes of clothes, my passport, the leather folder tucked carefully between them. I paused when I picked up Dad's letter. His handwriting had grown shaky, but the words carried strength. He had trusted me, chosen me. I slipped it into the lining of my bag, smiling faintly. I wasn't running away. I was stepping forward. Scars came with me, yes, but so did strength. I thought of the wisdom I'd once read. You can forgive for your peace, not for theirs. That was the path I chose. I whispered my mantra as I zipped the bag shut. I'm not escaping. I'm rising. London wasn't just an inheritance. It was the space for my rebirth, the proof that even after being broken, I could rebuild. When everything was packed, I carried the suitcase downstairs. The wheels bumped softly against each step, the sound steady, final. I left the keys on the table in the foyer, resting them on the wood where so many papers had once been laid against me. I wasn't leaving with anger. I was leaving with clarity. At the door, I paused for one last look. The house stood still, stripped of its false warmth. I turned the lock, slid it into place, and stepped outside into the sunlight of early summer. The air was warmer than it had been in months, the light brighter, as though the world itself welcomed me forward. The suitcase rolled behind me on the pavement, each wheel a punctuation mark to the end of this chapter. I walked out not as their daughter, not as their burden, but as myself. And as the wheels of my suitcase rolled on the pavement, I knew I was leaving ashes, but walking toward fire of my own making. The plane touched down in London just as dawn broke, the first light spilling across the horizon like a promise. My suitcase rattled behind me as I stepped into my father's flat for the first time. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, catching dust motes that danced in the air like tiny fragments of memory. The space smelled faintly of old books, as if time had waited for me to arrive before it let go. On the wall hung photographs of Dad in his younger years, him standing near a river, him smiling at a bookstore, him holding a stack of novels with that familiar gleam in his eye. I stood still, letting the air wash over me. For the first time in months, no one was watching me like prey. No one was plotting behind whispers or calculating how to erase me. This place wasn't just brick and mortar. It was my father's trust, my independence, my rebirth. And yet, the ache lingered. Betrayal doesn't vanish when you cross an ocean. But freedom, I realized, can soften the wound. I sank onto the couch, the leather creaking beneath me, and let my gaze wander across the room. Every humiliation I'd endured seemed to parade in my mind. The family photo where I had been cropped out, the nights I was forced into silence, the dinner where my mother called me a mistake. Each one had been a weapon they wielded to break me down. But instead of tears, clarity came. Each wound had sharpened me, carved edges where I once had none. They thought silence meant surrender. But silence was the blade I carried in secret, and now it gleamed in the light of truth. I whispered aloud, steady and calm. They thought they had written me out, but every exclusion only etched me deeper into my own story. In America, people love to say, "What doesn't kill you makes you stronger." Sitting in that London flat, I realized something sharper. What didn't kill me made me untouchable. I knew then I didn't need revenge in flames or theatrics. My existence here, my freedom, was revenge enough. That evening, I pulled out a sheet of paper and began drafting my last word to them. My hand didn't shake. The letter was short, firm, final. You erased me in life, I wrote. But Dad ensured I would never be erased in truth. This is my last word to you. I didn't lace it with bitterness. I didn't plead for recognition. Finality was stronger than anger. When I folded the letter and sealed it, I felt the same way I had when closing each door back in Boston, as if I were sealing the past brick by brick. I slipped the envelope into a drawer. Whether they read it or ignored it didn't matter. It was done. I reminded myself, you can forgive without reconciling. You can heal without returning. Family is supposed to be forever, but sometimes forever means walking away. Over the next week, I began to make the flat mine. I bought fresh flowers for the windowsills, their colors bright against the stone-gray skyline. I hung simple art on the walls, not elaborate, just enough to breathe warmth into the space. The emptiness of the flat slowly shifted into possibility. I realized as I arranged each detail that I was no longer the child of the family they had tried to trap in that role. Here, I was my own woman, independent, whole. Freedom carried its own ache. Loneliness is never simple, but it outweighed the pain of staying bound. One morning, I flung open the windows, letting light pour in. The city outside hummed alive, voices and footsteps blending into a song of motion. As the breeze filled the flat, I smiled. Unlocking those windows felt like unlocking my life again. Maya Angelou's words came to me. I can be changed by what happens to me, but I refuse to be reduced by it. That was the truth I lived now. On the final night of that first week, I brewed tea and carried it to the window. I sipped slowly, watching the sun dip low, the city glowing beneath me. I thought of the girl they had silenced in Boston, the one they cropped out of photos, dismissed at meetings, called a burden. She was gone. In her place was someone who had taken every blow and turned it into strength. They silenced me in their house. But here, in mine, my voice fills every room. And that is the loudest revenge of all.